I should have known the signs, but perhaps a part of me loved the thrill of the risk, the pull of our secrets. It was our honeymoon, a private island, white sand beaches, paradise. But no amount of beauty could hide the truth beneath my skin. I married a man who thought he could control me, another toy on his shelf. But today, he'd find out just how wrong he was. It began innocently enough, didn't it? He was the golden boy, all charm and teeth. He knew how to make people bend without breaking a sweat. And I was the quiet one, lost in his shadow. I believed I could live like that, with my silent sacrifices for his brilliant dreams. But the further we drifted into his world, the more I became a stranger, even to myself. Then came our honeymoon, the pinnacle of his plans. Together forever, he'd said at our wedding, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. At first, the island was intoxicating, the kind of beauty that feels stolen, unreal. But beneath the warm sand, the endless blue, I saw the shadows. His words grew harsher, demands more relentless, until I felt smothered in a paradise that belonged to him alone. One night, as the waves crashed outside our villa, I began to devise my plan. I hadn't meant to, not consciously at least. But there it was, a whisper that wouldn't fade. Revenge. I began to toy with him, a new cautious coldness in my words and actions, and he noticed, his control slipping, rage simmering just under his skin. I remember that final night vividly. I dressed in white silk, his favorite, as if that might mask the storm brewing within me. The candlelight flickered across his face as he lounged by the villa's private pool, watching me. His gaze was full of entitlement, that possessiveness that once seemed charming, but now made my skin crawl. As he took another sip of his wine, his voice laced with a slurred arrogance, I knew it was time. I joined him by the pool, handed him another glass, sweetened just right. He never saw it coming. As he drank, his words turned sluggish, his once sharp gaze dulling. He tried to speak, to lunge forward, but he was too late. I held his shoulders down, murmuring gentle words as he struggled. When the pool stilled and his body lay silent beneath the water, I felt nothing but peace. In the morning, I left a note for the villa staff and slipped onto the ferry back to the mainland. It read, "Paradise was never meant for two." They discovered him around noon. I watched from a distance, blending in with the other travelers on the ferry, as the resort staff scrambled, their panic obvious, even from afar. By the time I reached the mainland, the text messages had already started flooding in. "Are you all right? What happened? Where's Andrew?" His family had always been diligent about staying connected, a web of eyes always watching, monitoring our lives. I knew they'd come after me soon enough, but that was part of the plan. My whole life, I'd been the passive one, always reacting, accommodating. This time, I was finally in control. As I checked into a quiet hotel under a different name, I reflected on all the choices that led me here. It felt surreal, looking back. Andrew was the kind of man who never let things go, never forgave the smallest slight. The minute we married, I felt his grip tighten, and his calculated cruelty grew relentless. At first, he was charming, full of promises and quiet whispers of a shared future. But over time, those whispers turned to commands, then to thinly veiled threats. My life was shrinking to fit his mold, and he didn't care that I was suffocating. The only person who knew what he was really like was his sister, Elizabeth. She was suspicious of him too, and we used to exchange guarded glances at family gatherings. I remember the way she looked at me at the wedding, a flicker of warning in her eyes. Once, she had cornered me after a family dinner. "Be careful, Lucy," she whispered. "Men like Andrew, they never let go easily." Those words stuck with me. I never confronted her directly, but I could tell she'd seen his darker side. And now I was counting on her support, if not to shield me outright, then to help fan the flames of doubt, to make people believe that his own demons finally turned on him. The next day, the news broke. I watched it unfold on the hotel room's small TV. Honeymoon ends in tragedy. Groom found dead on remote island. They showed a picture of him, grinning in his tuxedo, that perfect mask that fooled so many. I almost didn't recognize him. As the reporters droned on, I could see the pieces falling into place, everything carefully staged to suggest an unfortunate accident, a private moment by the pool gone wrong. I had given just enough hints in the weeks leading up to our honeymoon to support the story I wanted everyone to believe. He's been drinking more, I'd told his family over dinner, my voice tinged with fake concern. I think the stress is getting to him. I hadn't realized how easily they'd buy into it, and Elizabeth, though shocked, was already on the phone with a lawyer, asking about inheritance details, handling everything like the practical woman she was. In time, she'd find a way to accept it. She might even believe I was just another casualty of her brother's self-destruction. For once, I'd written my own ending, shaped my own fate, and for the first time, I felt free. It didn't take long for the questions to start circling back to me. The authorities wanted a statement, just a standard interview, they said. "We know this must be hard for you, Mrs. Hale." I could hear the doubt creeping into their voices, the slight pause before Mrs. Hale, as though the title didn't quite fit. The interrogation room was icy, the walls painted a dull gray that made everything feel heavier, like I was sinking. They offered me coffee. I accepted, wrapping my fingers around the warm cup to steady myself. "Tell us about Andrew's drinking habits," one of the detectives began, voice neutral, but his eyes sharp. I didn't flinch. It was getting out of hand. I softened my voice, feigning hesitation. Our honeymoon was supposed to be a fresh start, but he couldn't seem to stop. I'd find him up late at night, pacing, drinking. I kept my eyes down just enough to look genuine. I tried to help him, but I let the words trail off, unfinished, knowing that the silence would say more than I ever could. The detectives exchanged a glance. "Did you see him that night?" "Yes, I went to bed early. We'd argued." I took a small breath, a calculated tremor in my voice. "He said he wanted to be alone, to clear his head by the pool." I paused, forcing a small tremble to my lips. I thought he'd just come to bed once he'd cooled off. Their questions kept coming, each one a little more pointed. But I'd prepared for this, rehearsed every response until the lines blurred between truth and fiction. And, after hours under the bright light, they finally ran out of questions. They released me, expressing condolences and telling me to stay close, in case there's more we need. I was almost at the hotel when I noticed the car following me. A sleek, unmarked sedan, windows tinted. I took a sharp turn, crossing a few streets to test if they'd stay on me. They did. I kept walking, pretending not to notice, and slipped inside a coffee shop, ducking low behind a booth to catch my breath. What I hadn't counted on was that the detective, the one who asked about Andrew's drinking, was relentless. I hadn't known then, but he was famous for solving cases by instinct, the kind of cop who trusted his gut over facts. And my story had left him unsettled. Elizabeth was also proving to be a problem. She called me every day, asking questions that seemed simple at first, but grew sharper, more personal. I didn't know if she was trying to trap me or simply needed someone to share her grief with. But either way, her probing was dangerous. She started showing up unexpectedly, her eyes narrowing whenever I'd stumble over a response. "Lucy, you're not telling me everything, are you?" she said one afternoon, fixing me with that piercing gaze of hers. I forced a weak smile. "It's just been hard to process, Elizabeth. Everything feels surreal." Her lips tightened, her expression unreadable. "I know you loved him," she said, her voice a low, accusing whisper. "But you're not as good at hiding things as you think." I felt the blood drain from my face. Elizabeth always was perceptive, a natural skeptic who saw past facades. I knew I needed to do something, to shake her off before she could piece together the truth. And so, I began my next move. Elizabeth's words haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was unraveling everything, pulling at the loose threads I thought I'd hidden so carefully. If I wanted my freedom, I had to be as precise now as I was with Andrew. Elizabeth's instincts were too sharp. She was too close. That night, I invited her to dinner. We sat across from each other at a candle-lit table, the flickering light casting shadows that seemed to dance in her eyes, sharp and knowing. I softened my voice, leaned forward with just the right amount of grief in my expression. "Elizabeth, I know you're hurting too," I murmured. "Andrew meant the world to both of us." She nodded, studying me, suspicion mingling with exhaustion. I waited a beat, carefully letting a tear slide down my cheek. I think he was in trouble. He was so different those last days, so volatile. I was scared. I didn't know how to help him. Her expression shifted, softening just enough to give me hope. She sighed, her gaze distant, as though recalling old memories. "He always hid things well. Secrets were his talent, not yours, Lucy," she said, but her tone was less accusing now, more resigned. When she finally left that evening, I felt the smallest flicker of relief. I'd planted just enough seeds of doubt. Andrew was no saint after all. People knew he had a temper, that he could be controlling. All I needed was for her to believe in his darkness enough to look past mine. The following week, the detective called, requesting another meeting. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Elizabeth was with him, her face pale and solemn. My heart pounded, but I managed a weak smile, masking my unease. "Lucy," the detective began, his voice slow, each word a step closer to the truth. "We've looked into Andrew's behavior before his death, and, well, some things don't add up. There's no history of any drinking problem, not even a single mention in his medical files or by anyone who knew him." My pulse quickened, but I feigned surprise. "Are you sure? He'd only started drinking heavily recently." I thought I was helping him cope." The detective's gaze didn't waver. "We also found something else. A series of texts Andrew sent to a friend before the honeymoon. Messages about concerns he had about your behavior, Lucy. He mentioned feeling distant, that you seemed withdrawn, secretive." My stomach dropped, but I held steady. "I was just trying to make him happy," I whispered, letting my voice break just enough. Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice icy. "I wanted to believe you, Lucy, but you've woven a story around my brother's death that doesn't make sense. Andrew wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve this." Her words settled over me, and I knew it was over. Every detail I had crafted, every lie, was unraveling in front of them both. My world shrank as I watched their faces, my plan crumbling under the weight of their scrutiny. The detective's expression hardened, and he placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice low. "Lucy Hale, you're under arrest for the murder of Andrew Hale." As the handcuffs snapped around my wrists, I felt a hollow ache settle in my chest. The game was over, and I had lost.